Metroid Dread is a game I still can't believe exists in its current form. It was initially conceived as a Nintendo DS title in the mid-aughts, but was eventually cancelled due to hardware limitations, as we found out years later. This would leave the 2D Metroid series dormant for over a decade. Following 2002's Metroid Fusion and 2004's remake of the original Metroid, titled Metroid Zero Mission, there wouldn't be another 2D Metroid game until a remake of Metroid 2, titled Metroid Samus Returns, would release for the Nintendo 3DS in 2017, after the Nintendo Switch had launched earlier that year. And while Metroid Samus Returns was a promising title in many ways, there were a few glaring criticisms of the game that not only stemmed from the source material it was based on, but some of the new gameplay mechanics that could use some refinement as well. Thankfully, while Samus Returns released on a dying platform and didn't set the world on fire critically or commercially, developer Mercury Steam was given the opportunity to resurrect the previously cancelled Metroid Dread, which finally released alongside the franchise's 35th anniversary in 2021 on the Nintendo Switch. Of course, I purchased a digital copy day one alongside the Amiibo bundle and the special edition, which is something I rarely do these days, as one of my favorite franchises seemed to be making a bold return. And looking back on what the original Metroid Dread could have been, I'll say in retrospect, I'm glad it didn't release on the DS back in the day. Because even if it had, people would be clamoring for a remake right about now anyway, due to many DS games' reliance on the second screen, as well as non-pixel art DS games looking like complete dog shit. And so the question is, how did Metroid Dread fare without the hardware limitations of the DS and nearly 20 years of games industry advancement since the last non-remake 2D Metroid title? Let's get into it. As always, if you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing. These very detailed videos take a lot of time and effort to make, so I really appreciate any and all engagement on these types of projects. And if you want to hear more of my thoughts on previous 2D Metroid titles, I encourage you to check out the videos I've done on those games in the past. Metroid Dread opens with a brief recap of Samus's adventure in Metroid Fusion, which honestly really makes me want to see a Metroid Fusion remake in Dread's style. With the X-Parasites thought to have been wiped out in the previous game, the Galactic Federation receives surprise video footage of a wild X-Parasite from an unknown sender. The Federation tracks the location of the video to planet ZDR, and sends robots called E.M.M.I, which are specifically designed to hunt and extract X-Parasite DNA, to rid the galaxy of this potential threat. However, after losing contact with the E.M.M.I, Samus takes it upon herself, as the only living being immune to the X-Parasites, to investigate what's happening on ZDR and put a stop to it. Adam does advise against this, but Samus silently insists on finishing what she started. Contrary to every other Metroid game in which you start the game from the landing site and make your way into the planet, Samus actually manages to get to the depths of ZDR no problem without player input, before encountering an intimidating figure clad in Chozo armor. Unable to contend with it, she blacks out, only to wake up not far from where the battle took place, dressed in a brand new power suit. And now, upon taking control of Samus in the depths of planet ZDR, the player must guide her to the surface to escape whatever trap has been set for her. Presentation-wise, Metroid Dread is incredible. While most 2.5D titles end up looking like budget titles, I think Dread's art direction and environmental design look excellent despite being in 2.5D. But even more so than that, Dread has a ton of small touches that I fucking love. Such as the way the camera zooms in or out depending on the size of the room, the way Samus steps or vaults over low platforms automatically, allowing for less blocky terrain and more natural traversal of it, how Samus puts her hand up against the wall when you press up against one, the way that sliding under a gap automatically puts you in ball form once you unlock it, and the way you automatically uncurl from ball form when exiting a narrow passageway. And generally, the way Samus carries herself in this game is that of someone who can read your every move without even breaking a sweat. It gives Samus a more prevalent sense of personality without shoehorning in monotone dialogue at every turn. Now, also in the presentation realm, one of the most common criticisms Metroid Dread has received is regarding its soundtrack. For one, audio balancing is better than in Samus Returns, but I still wish there were sliders for music and sound effects, as almost every modern game has these, except for many Nintendo games. That being said, Metroid Dread's soundtrack leans heavily into the atmospheric side of things, which leads to many of these tracks feeling unmemorable. And while I do agree with this criticism to a point, I think this OST gets dismissed a little bit too easily. While you won't walk away from Metroid Dread humming many of the melodies like you would in some of the previous games, I think it sets the tone of the game wonderfully. And since many older video game soundtracks were designed to loop frequently in order to A, save space on the cartridge, and B, account for any amount of length a player may spend in a particular area, I think many people who grew up with video games became accustomed to music in games being very melodic and catchy, and this was clearly by design. However, as games have evolved as a medium and technical limitations have become less of a strain on development, it's allowed for game composers to write more through composed works as opposed to something with a more predictable structure. I actually studied music in college, and by virtue of that have been to countless concerts. I've seen and heard all kinds of classical and contemporary music, some of which was admittedly less than enjoyable, but there were those rare instances of a contemporary or experimental piece that, while I wasn't whistling it on my way home, either left some kind of impression on me or set a particular atmosphere in the concert hall that you wouldn't get by just blasting it in the car or at the gym, for instance. And that's exactly what Metroid Dread's soundtrack is to me. While there are some tracks I do like to listen to outside the game, and some subtle leitmotifs across the various tracks in the game, in addition to some references to older Metroid soundtracks, there are admittedly a good amount of tracks in the OST that are best served as part of the gameplay experience, rather than being separated from it. Metroid Dread ends up feeling like a combination of the best parts of Samus Returns and Fusion, while improving upon the aspects of those games I'm not as fond of, starting with both of those games' more perceivable linearity. While Dread does subtly guide you towards the critical path via its level design, Adam isn't constantly breathing down your neck at every turn like in Fusion. Typically, his dialogue boils down to explaining a new ability you just acquired, or a vague goal to achieve in a given area. And unlike in Samus Returns, which didn't require backtracking to previous areas, Dread features a map structure more akin to Super Metroid or Zero Mission, which I much prefer. And I was so pleasantly surprised when I discovered that I did need to go back to a previous area to get the next upgrade. However, since the size and shape of the environments aren't portrayed to you in squares on the map like the older games, it can be difficult to decipher what exactly you're looking at on a first playthrough. Initially, I was worried the map design would prove to be unmemorable thanks to the less rigid layout of the rooms. While I can't always recall a particular room just from looking at the map, it does start to click as I get closer to my destination. On my first two playthroughs, both of which were on normal, I didn't stray too far from what seemed like the intended path, but after many months, as I made my way through the game on hard mode, I decided to go for some sequence breaks I had heard of, and found quite a bit of satisfaction pulling off some of those small tricks to do so. Now, perhaps the most notable aspect of Dread's structure and map design is the presence of E.M.M.I zones located in each area of ZDR. This is a somewhat contentious part of the game that I just don't quite understand the criticism for. To boil it down, since Samus's DNA contains that of the X-Parasites, the E.M.M.I view Samus as no more than a host to the most threatening lifeform in the galaxy, and so they hunt her as such. The E.M.M.I reside in predetermined zones that Samus will come across within Planet ZDR's various locales, and these are actually some of my favorite parts of the game due to the unpredictable nature of the E.M.M.I's movements. They always spawn nearby Samus, so you have to move fast and smart through these segments to avoid getting caught, but even if you do get caught, Samus is given 2 consecutive chances to escape, with variable windows of execution. I may be in the minority on this, but I really love the reactionary nature of this feature. It's able to keep me on my toes on repeat playthroughs while not feeling unfair. And even if you fail to execute this maneuver and get a game over, Metroid Dread is very generous by giving the player a checkpoint whenever they enter one of these areas, while the E.M.M.I is still active at least. And the same goes for the boss fights. This design decision provides a difficult experience, but not a punishing one, which is a key distinction that makes all the difference. Being able to attempt a challenge immediately after failing is the ideal for me in games like this. Some people like having to trudge their way back to difficult encounters to cool off, I guess. I don't really get it. If you need to cool off that badly, you could just stop playing the game and then come back to it when you're ready to try again if you're getting that worked up. But ultimately, the way to take down these E.M.M.Is permanently is to find the control room housing the mini Mother Brain / Aurora units and absorb them in order to blast away the E.M.M.I's protective faceplate and destroying the eye underneath. And this can lead to some fairly dynamic, puzzly kinds of segments, trying to figure out the optimal stretch of environment to break the faceplate off and ultimately destroy the E.M.M.I. Some of the later ones are a little restricting in that regard, and I'm not the biggest fan of that, but the ones that are flexible in how you handle it, I really liked. And overall, while I do find the E.M.M.I to be a massive step up from the way the SAX was handled in Fusion, I actually wish there were moments when the E.M.M.I could wander outside of their designated zones to add even more tension. Though, since their mobility was designed with the E.M.M.I zones specifically in mind, it would take more than a simple drag and drop to apply this. Maybe if Metroid Fusion gets a remake in the style of Dread though, the SAX could stalk the player throughout the entire game, like something out of Resident Evil for instance, and that would be sick. I'd love to see that. Samus controls better than she ever has. She's speedy and light on her feet, like she was in Fusion, but with some additional mobility options that feel like a natural progression of Samus Returns gameplay. Firstly, I've changed my mind on my opinion of the wall jump change in Mercury Steam's Metroid games. While I do find the wall jump in the older 2D Metroid titles very satisfying to pull off, I actually don't think it suits the analog control of Samus Returns or Dread as much, which is contrary to what I said in the Samus Returns video. Speaking of analog control, while I typically prefer to use the D-pad in side-scrollers, I find the way Samus handles isn't hindered by using the analog stick to move her around. Worst case, it makes the Shine Spark a bit less precise, but you are given some time to decide your angle to compensate for this, and Samus turns her head in the direction you're aiming as a small visual indicator to help with this. There's also a few new mobility options at Samus's disposal in Metroid Dread. In previous Metroid games, there's no way for Samus to crawl through small gaps prior to getting the Morph Ball. But in Dread, Samus is given a slide from the very beginning that lets her squeeze through such areas, allowing for more interesting level design early on. Now, thankfully, this doesn't invalidate the usefulness of the Morph Ball either, since there are some areas that you can't simply slide straight through, and as I mentioned before, Samus will conveniently enter Morph Ball mode automatically following the slide animation. Now, the last mobility option made available to Samus from the start of the game is being able to instantly jump out of a ledge grab, allowing you to essentially chain ledge grabs in some instances. This maneuver isn't so integral that beginners will be missing out, but it's a small optimization that experienced players no doubt enjoy taking advantage of. Mechanics like this are the best in these kinds of games, rewarding franchise veterans while not outright punishing newcomers simultaneously. Now, more so than general gameplay and mobility, the combat in Metroid Dread feels like a massive improvement from Samus Returns. One benefit to being on the Switch instead of the 3DS is not requiring the touchscreen in order to activate certain abilities. Look, I love the 3DS and some DS and Wii games, but those types of gimmicks make it harder than it should to bring games from those systems forward to new systems, and only serve to age these games faster than they otherwise would. Now, back to Metroid Dread's combat improvements, the main one besides not relying on a touchscreen is that the melee counter is actually fun to use compared to Samus Returns. In that game, you could only counter while standing still, and enemies were made insanely spongy to incentivize the use of this move to stun and dispatch them. Dread allows you to not only use this melee counter while jumping, but also allows you to do a running melee attack to stun enemies and sometimes even instantly kill weaker enemies. This change makes Dread's combat feel even more flexible and even indirectly improve Samus's mobility by allowing her to blitz through some rooms you would have previously had to damage boost through or straight up dodge enemies in order to get through quickly. The combat changes made in this game make engaging enemies satisfying in a way that previous 2D Metroid games kinda aren't. Even our Lord and Savior Super Metroid didn't focus too heavily on combat because most of its strengths lie elsewhere. Add to this one of my favorite new abilities in Dread being the Flash Shift, which allows you to dash up to 3 times horizontally in either direction, making some of the later boss fights really fun and engaging as a result. Now, speaking of boss fights, the boss fights in Metroid Dread are yet another contention people have with the game, and I can understand that to an extent. The later you get into the game, the boss fights get less memorable and creative, but add to that, most arena encounters in the late game are variations of X-Parasite infested Chozo, which, while serving more so as mini-bosses in my opinion, doesn't exactly make up for the lack of true boss fights prior to the final boss. I do have to note though that the truly creative boss fights in Metroid Dread are fantastic, and as you would expect, have numerous ways that you can approach the fight, and there are some that are outright skippable if you go the right way on the map, or figure out some unique combat applications for some of your abilities. And I'd say in general, the moments leading up to the ending scenario of Metroid Dread feel a bit rushed. It doesn't bother me too much since I prefer my Metroidvanias to be on the shorter side to incentivize replayability more, but it's still pretty noticeable nonetheless. Around halfway through the game, Samus encounters an E.M.M.I in Ferenia, which is conveniently shut down just before it manages to fulfill its directive. And here, the first ever living Chozo in the series, named Quiet Robe, reveals himself to Samus to explain what exactly has been happening on ZDR. Quiet Robe is a member of the Toha tribe, who are seemingly a more scientific and peaceful sect of the Chozo. Contrary to the armored foe Samus encountered during the opening sequence, the leader of the Malkin tribe, Ravenbeak. As we know from Metroid 2 and Fusion, the Metroids were created by the Chozo to combat the X-Parasites on SR388, but the Metroids proved to be far too dangerous, which forced the Chozo to seal them away in the depths of the planet. Turns out the Toha tribe wanted to destroy the remaining Metroids completely, while the Malkin wanted to weaponize them, not unlike the Space Pirates from the original game. But it's not that simple, as the Toha are the tribe with the ability to control the Metroids, leading to Quiet Robe's forced cooperation at the hands of the tyrant Ravenbeak. When Quiet Robe arrived at the Malkin homeworld of ZDR, one of the soldiers infected by the X spread it across the entire planet to everyone except for Quiet Robe and Ravenbeak. Now this undoubtedly put the Metroid weaponizing plan on hold, but when the dust finally settled on ZDR, it was too late, since Samus herself had already eradicated every last Metroid on SR388 in the events of Metroid 2. And as we know from the events of Super Metroid and Fusion, some Metroid DNA was able to be salvaged from and was injected into Samus to rid the X-Parasites from her body following her misadventure on the former Metroid homeworld, thus essentially making Samus the last remaining Metroid in the galaxy. Quiet Robe reveals to Samus that while the E.M.M.I were initially designed to target the X-Parasites, Ravenbeak had reprogrammed them to extract the Metroid DNA from Samus's body, to complete his plan of weaponizing the titular creatures. And Samus fucking speaks Chozo. Holy shit, that was such an amazing moment. Definitely did not expect that on my first playthrough. Now unfortunately, at the end of this exchange, Quiet Robe is surprisingly assassinated by a guard robot. Not much later, Samus comes across an area on ZDR blocked off by a massive gate, which reveals itself to be a containment facility for the X-Parasites that Ravenbeak's crew brought back from SR388. That initial reveal that X-Parasites were going to be present in the game going forward was such an awesome moment. Because following the initial announcement trailer for Dread, I went into this game completely blind, so I had no idea about this, or even the return of Kraid, for instance. But yeah, following the exploration of this area, the X are then unleashed onto the entire rest of the map, in some ways completely changing how some areas feel to traverse and fight through. And as you approach the final showdown with Ravenbeak, Samus begins to awaken the true power of her Metroid DNA, and she even straight up grabs an E.M.M.I's needle and absorbs all of its power near instantly. Now with the power bombs acquired from this last E.M.M.I, Samus takes a pod that looks straight out of BioShock up to Ravenbeak's ship. Upon reaching yet another terminal to communicate with Adam, Adam explains that Samus's transformation into a Metroid is complete, and that her Toha genes must have slowed the process due to their ability to control the Metroids. But Adam seems to be dumping a lot of personal and threatening rhetoric at Samus compared to his usual demeanor, and it's then revealed that Ravenbeak has been guiding Samus the whole time since her blackout at the beginning of the game, and that Ravenbeak's goal of awakening Samus's true Metroid power was his goal all along during her journey through ZDR. Samus gives Ravenbeak a big thumbs down by blowing his ruse to smithereens, at which point Ravenbeak expresses his disappointment in his daughter for being so disobedient. Samus wins a hard-fought battle against her surrogate father, and I'll just let the game do the talking for this scene. Following this absolutely insane sequence of events, Metroid Dread closes out with a series staple being a grand escape sequence, this time using Samus's Metroid powers to annihilate everything in her path back to the ship, at which point...
You drain the ship of its energy.
I'm unsure exactly how Quiet Robe was able to consciously bring himself to Samus's ship in order to help her here, since he was being controlled by an X-Parasite, but I'm not really too concerned with the details, so I guess I'll allow it. The planet blows up following Samus's escape, supposedly ending the main story arc for the franchise that started all the way back on the NES 35 years prior. Now, no doubt we'll get more Metroid games in the future, but they'll likely be some combination of remakes, side arcs like the Prime games kind of serve as, or maybe even exploring some facets of the Metroid universe we haven't been privy to. Metroid Dread ends up being a combination of what I wanted Fusion to be from a narrative and structure standpoint, and what feels like a natural progression of Samus Returns from a gameplay standpoint, which is more or less what I predicted following the game's announcement. But as good as I thought the game looked from its initial trailer, I did not expect for it to be this good. I've really been debating whether I prefer this game to Super Metroid, which deserves all the praise it gets as a classic among classics, but I really wanted to finalize my thoughts on this, which is partially why this video took so long since Metroid Dread came out. But I think I can safely say that I do prefer Metroid Dread by a small margin, which is really hard for me to admit. I do think in some ways Super Metroid will remain unmatched, but it's hard not to look at Metroid Dread favorably in this debate because of just how great it feels to play moment to moment. Now, I rarely mention the cost of games in my videos since my intent most of the time isn't to review the game and tell you whether it's worth buying or not, but the price of Metroid Dread has been such a sticking point for people that I feel I should at least briefly discuss it. The rise of 2D Metroidvanias in the indie scene has been huge over the past generation or so. It's up there with roguelites as being one of the most common indie genres. And while there are some major standouts, it's often tough to determine which of them is worth your money, though these indie offerings rarely push past the $20 to $30 range and therefore don't pose as much of a risk to your wallet. So Metroid Dread coming in at a whopping $60 is a hard sell for some people, understandably. Metroid games historically have a very short runtime for a single playthrough, so for those not looking for a highly replayable game in a niche genre, it's definitely a hard sell. And how exactly are you supposed to know if you want to replay a game many times over before even experiencing it once? There's a demo, but that small chunk of the game only provides so much insight into how the game ultimately plays by the end, given the way that combat and exploration exponentially expand in this game. But a single playthrough only lasts around 4 to 6 hours in-game time. Not exactly flattering for those who think a game's value equals the amount of time they can get out of a single playthrough. But as someone who's been playing Metroid games for many years now, I was able to see Metroid Dread at a glance and say, yep, this looks like a high quality Metroid title, take my money. I guess my point is, someone who is familiar with this style of game could probably look at some gameplay and determine if it's worth the buy for them. But for someone less experienced with this fairly niche genre, in a franchise that tends to get overlooked, there are certainly cheaper alternatives to get you more acquainted with Metroidvanias in general. Nintendo's retro offerings on the Switch aren't exactly robust, but Super Metroid is included with their online service if you already pay for that. And if you're not afraid to do a bit of sailing the seven seas, you can pretty easily find ROMs of some of the less accessible titles in the series like Zero Mission or Fusion. Those games could play on a literal potato at this point. And of course there's the plethora of indie games I mentioned earlier at much lower price points, which may be enticing for some. So yeah, Metroid Dread's value is going to be in the eye of the beholder, but assuming you're willing to spend money on a quality product, regardless of how long you may spend with that product, I can't possibly look at my experience with Metroid Dread and regret it one bit. It exceeded my fairly high expectations for it, and has become my favorite 2D Metroid title. So there's not really much more I can ask for as far as Metroid Dread's quality. And because it is a smaller scale project compared to many first-party Switch games, it's not really hindered by the fact that the Switch is a piece of shit. As always, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.